How desperate would a woman have to be to abandon her vows, her sanctuary, her very identity, all for a fleeting chance at freedom? What forces could compel a soul to risk eternal damnation and earthly punishment just to slip past ancient stone walls and vigilant eyes in the heart of medieval Europe? Number 7. The rope of rosaries and a perilous plunge from the Tower of Saint Agatha. The Convent of Saint Agatha, perched like a watchful hawk above the windswept plains of Aquitaine, was a formidable fortress of faith and stone. Walls thick and scarred by centuries of weather rose 30 feet high, crowned with battlements that spoke more of a keep than a sanctuary. The main tower, known to the sisters simply as the bell tower, loomed even higher, its stone steps worn smooth by the passage of countless feet, leading to a belfry that offered a panoramic view of the world the nuns had forsaken. For Sister Agnes, a young woman of 22 years, forced into the Benedictine order at the age of 12, after her family suffered financial ruin, that world, the one beyond the walls, called to her with an insistent whisper. Agnes possessed a quiet strength, a resilience forged in years of forced piety. Her hands, calloused from scrubbing flagstones and tending the convent garden, were surprisingly adept. Her eyes, often downcast in humility, held a sharp, observant glint. She had spent a decade within those walls, observing the routines, the habits of the elderly gatekeeper, the precise timing of the night watch, the hidden nooks and crannies where old liturgical vestments were stored and where dust motes danced in forgotten shafts of light. Her days unfolded in a relentless rhythm of prayer, labor, and silence. The bells of Saint Agatha dictated every breath. Prime at dawn, terse as the sun climbed. Sext at noon, none in the afternoon. Vespers as dusk gathered Compline before sleep, and matins in the deep hours before the first hint of morning. Each chime was a hammer blow, driving deeper the nails of her captivity. The desire for escape, a forbidden thought, had festered in Agnes's heart for years, a tiny seed of rebellion nurtured in the sterile soil of monastic life. It wasn't a sudden passion, but a slow, creeping desperation, fed by the constant hum of the wind over the battlements and the distant, unseen movements of the secular world. She knew the risks. Punishment for a nun who broke her vows and attempted escape was severe, ranging from indefinite solitary confinement in the convent's meager oubliette to being transferred to a stricter, more isolated order, or even in extreme cases, public penance and degradation. The Church's grip was absolute, its reach long. But the thought of a life spent in endless prayer, a life not chosen, was a prison she felt she could no longer endure. Agnes's plan, audacious in its simplicity, revolved around the bell tower. It was the tallest point in the convent, offering the most direct route over the wall. But how to descend? Rope was a precious commodity, kept under lock and key, used for hoisting buckets from the well or securing heavy loads. It was impossible to steal enough without immediate detection. Her mind, however, was a forge of ingenuity. She looked to the ubiquitous tools of her captivity, the rosaries. Every sister had at least one, often several, hanging from their belts, tucked into their habits, or draped over their beds. These were not just beads. They were strong, woven cords, sometimes of leather, often of tightly braided linen or hemp, designed to withstand daily use. If she could gather enough, she might weave them together. The gathering began subtly. Agnes started a quiet project in the common workroom during the allotted needlework hour. She would volunteer to mend worn habits, to rebraid frayed cords on crucifixes, to organize the overflowing chests of worn vestments. During this time, she began to discreetly collect old, broken, or discarded rosaries, claiming they needed extensive repair or that she was repurposing the beads for a new communal project. She also found lengths of strong twine used for bundling herbs or securing parcels, slowly accumulating a stash in a loose floorboard beneath her small bed in her cell. Convent chronicle from the early 14th century, preserved in the archives of the Diocese of Bordeaux, notes a curious entry from the Abbess Isabella's daily ledger. Item: Sister Agnes requests more flaxen thread for the repair of the sisters' rosaries. Her industry is commendable. Little did the abbess know Agnes's industry was for a very different purpose. Over a period of 2 months, working in the scarce hours between Compline and Matins, and sometimes during the quiet contemplation hour when most sisters sought spiritual repose, Agnes meticulously unraveled the collected rosaries. She untwisted the individual strands, then rebraided them into longer, stronger lengths. She practiced knotting them, using simple, secure fisherman's bends and square knots, ensuring each connection was taut and would bear her weight. Her fingers, accustomed to the delicate work of embroidery, moved with a feverish precision. The growing length of rope, a crude but sturdy lifeline, was carefully coiled and hidden beneath the straw mattress of her cot, disguised by a pile of mending. It was a painstaking, slow process, fraught with the constant fear of discovery. A misplaced bead, a stray thread, a curious glance from a passing sister. Any of these could unravel her desperate plan. The final element of her scheme was the timing. The convent gate was locked at sunset, and remained so until sunrise, guarded by Brother Thomas, a sleepy, elderly lay brother who often dozed at his post. But the bell tower, though rarely visited except by the bell ringer, was less secure. Its door leading to the winding stairs was often left unlocked during the day. At night, it was typically bolted from the outside. However, the feast day of Saint Jude, a day of particular solemnity and extended vigil, presented a unique opportunity. On this night, the bells would be rung throughout the night by a rotating team of sisters, culminating in a special pre-dawn mass. Tower door would remain open, allowing the bell ringers access without disturbing the sleeping convent. Agnes, having long cultivated a reputation for diligent service, volunteered for the final bell ringing shift from an hour before matins until dawn. It was a long, cold shift, but it was her only chance. The night of Saint Jude's feast arrived, a moonless sky cloaking the world in inky blackness. A biting wind whispered through the cloister, rattling the windows of the cells. Agnes, dressed in her dark woolen habit, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs, carried her coiled rope, nearly 50 feet of meticulously braided rosary cords, hidden beneath her ample scapular. She carried a small, sharp gardening trowel, a borrowed tool she had secreted away, tucked into her belt. The trowel was for dislodging any loose stones or for digging a shallow foothold if necessary. At the stroke of the 3rd hour after midnight, just as the chill of the night deepened, Agnes took her place in the bell tower. Her breath plumed in the frigid air as she climbed the circular stairs, the heavy rope bumping against her hip. 2 sisters before her, Sister Benedicta and Sister Eleanor, were bundled in thick cloaks, their faces pale in the faint light of a sputtering lantern. They had just finished their shift, their hands aching from pulling the heavy bell ropes. "Cold watch, Sister Agnes," Sister Benedicta mumbled, yawning. "May Saint Jude keep you warm." Agnes nodded, her voice caught in her throat. "And you, sister?" She managed, her hands trembling slightly as she grasped the rough hemp of the bell rope. As Benedicta and Eleanor descended, their footsteps echoing down the spiral staircase, Agnes found herself alone. The only sounds were the mournful creak of the belfry timbers and the relentless moan of the wind. She waited, listening intently for the distant click of the tower door being secured from the outside. It was a moment of agonizing suspense. Then a faint thunk reached her ears. The door was now bolted. She was trapped inside the tower. But this was part of her plan. She now had uninterrupted time until the sisters returned for the special dawn mass. Her eyes scanned the belfry opening. It was a wide, arched aperture, designed to broadcast the sound of the bells across the plains. She moved with quiet determination, her movements precise and practiced. First, she secured one end of her braided rope. She found a sturdy stone gargoyle, its weathered face peering out into the darkness, its base anchored deep within the tower's structure. With trembling hands, she looped the rope around its neck, testing its strength with a sharp tug it held. Then she began to lower the length of the rope out of the belfry. The descent was steeper than she had anticipated, the distance to the ground daunting. She felt the wind whip her habit, threatening to tear her grip from the stone. Her plan was to rappel down the side of the tower, then use the gardening trowel to aid in scaling the last few feet of the convent wall, which was slightly lower near the main tower. She had observed the wall from the tower during daytime bell-ringing duties, noting a slight crumbling in the mortar near the base, a potential foothold. The first few feet of descent were terrifying. Her hands, despite her efforts, burned as the rough rope slid through them. She clung to the cold stone, finding purchase in narrow crevices, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Trowel, tucked into her belt, scraped against the stone, a sound that seemed deafening in the silence of the night. Her feet scrabbled for purchase on the rough-hewn blocks. She knew the wall would be patrolled by the night watch, 2 lay brothers who walked the perimeter every 2 hours. She had roughly an hour and a half before their next round. As she reached the level of the main convent roof, a new obstacle presented itself. The roof sloped sharply, covered in slick, moss-covered tiles. A misstep here would send her tumbling onto the stone courtyard below, a fall that would surely be fatal. She swung herself away from the tower, her feet searching for a purchase on the roof. Her habit, heavy with the morning dew, dragged at her, threatening to pull her balance. She used the trowel, digging its pointed end into the gaps between the tiles, slowly, painstakingly moving across the slippery surface towards the outer edge of the wall. Each movement was deliberate, each breath held in her throat. Finally, she reached the outer wall, her body aching, her fingers numb with cold. Below her, the ground seemed impossibly far away. The rope, which seemed so long in her cell, now appeared agonizingly short. She estimated she was still a good 10 feet from the ground. The bottom section of the wall, she knew, was sheer, offering no handholds. This was the most dangerous part. She began the final descent, her body trembling with exhaustion and fear. Her grip on the rope began to slip, her skin chafed and raw. Suddenly, a sound from below, a distant dog, barked. Then the rhythmic crunch of footsteps on gravel, the night watch. They were early, or perhaps her estimate had been off. Panic surged through her veins. She had to move. Now, with a desperate surge of strength, she propelled herself down, letting the last few feet of rope slide through her raw palms. She dropped the final distance, landing awkwardly on the damp earth outside the wall. A sharp pain shot through her ankle. She stumbled, falling to her knees. The trowel clattered on the ground beside her. She scrambled to her feet, ignoring the searing pain, her eyes scanning the darkness. The footsteps were closer now, the murmurs of the lay brothers audible. They would be turning the corner of the wall at any moment. She had to disappear. Adrenaline coursing through her, Agnes limped away from the wall, plunging into the thicket of thorny bushes that lined the edge of the convent grounds. The branches tore at her habit, scratching her face and hands, but she pushed through, desperate for cover. The heavy sounds of the convent bells, now starting their pre-dawn peal, filled the air, marking the imminent return of the sisters to the bell tower for the special mass. She knew her escape would be discovered soon. The missing bell ringer, the rope hanging from the belfry. It would not take long. She did not look back. She pushed deeper into the surrounding forest. The pain in her ankle, the constant throb, her lungs burning, the cold biting at her exposed skin. But for the first time in 10 years, she was moving towards something unknown, something that held the promise of a life not dictated by stone walls and the relentless chime of bells. Chronicle of Saint Agatha contains no further mention of Sister Agnes after the feast of Saint Jude. only an entry recording the urgent repair of the belfry gargoyle. Number 6. The basket of herbs and the open gate of the Convent of the Sacred Heart. Convent of the Sacred Heart, nestled in a bustling market town in Flanders, was renowned not for its imposing defenses, but for its thriving herb garden and its production of medicinal tinctures and salves. Sister Marie, a petite woman with shrewd, intelligent eyes and a deep knowledge of botany, had been a professed nun for 15 years. She was the convent's chief herbalist, responsible for cultivating the extensive gardens, drying the medicinal plants, and preparing the remedies that were sold to the local populace. Marie had not been forced into the convent, rather, she had entered willingly at a young age, seeking refuge and scholarly pursuits. However, as the years passed, the quiet life of the cloister began to chafe. She yearned for the world beyond the walls, for the vibrant chaos of the market, for the freedom to study and practice her healing arts without the strictures of monastic life. Convent, unlike many of its more isolated counterparts, had a steady stream of traffic. Local villagers came daily to purchase remedies, to seek advice from the sisters, or to bring donations of food and supplies. A large wooden gate, supervised by the portress, Sister Eleanor, provided the only access point. Sister Eleanor, a kind but rather dim-witted woman, was often distracted by conversations or the demands of her duties. Marie had observed this with keen interest, noting the patterns of the gates opening and closing, the times of peak activity, and the moments when Sister Eleanor's attention was most likely to wander. Marie's plan hinged on the mundane routines of the convent's daily commerce. Every market day, large baskets of dried herbs and prepared salves were carried from the dispensary, located near the main gate, to a designated stall in the town square. These baskets, usually large wicker creations with sturdy lids, were heavy and required several sisters to carry, or sometimes were loaded onto a small hand cart operated by one of the lay brothers or servants. Marie had a particular affinity for one large, deep basket used for transporting bulk quantities of chamomile and lavender. It was large enough, she thought, to contain a person, albeit uncomfortably. Her preparation began months in advance. She started making herself indispensable in the dispensary, volunteering for extra shifts, organizing the supplies, and learning the precise inventory. She knew every nook and cranny of the small building, including a narrow storage alcove where empty baskets were kept, often unnoticed. She began to subtly alter the large chamomile basket. She widened a few of the woven gaps near the base, creating tiny, almost invisible air holes. She lined the inside with soft, unused linen cloths, ostensibly to protect the herbs from bruising, but in reality, to cushion her eventual journey. She also began to surreptitiously stash a few essential items inside the basket. A small pouch of coins she had slowly accumulated from her family's occasional gifts, a simple change of clothes, and a small, sharp knife she usually used for trimming herbs. The knife was a precaution, a tool for cutting her way out if the basket became stuck or she needed to escape quickly. The convent's inventory records, detailed in the 13th century Annals of the Sacred Heart, note a significant increase in the use of linen for packaging and transport, a detail that seemed innocuous at the time. The market day chosen for the escape was a bustling one, the feast of Saint Nicholas. The town square would be thronged with people, the convent stall particularly busy. Sister Eleanor, the portress, would be overwhelmed, her attention divided by the constant stream of visitors and vendors. The day promised chaos, and chaos was Marie's ally. On the morning of the feast day, as the first rays of sun pierced through the stained glass windows of the convent chapel, Marie went about her duties as usual, her face serene, her movements calm. She joined the sisters for matins and lauds, her voice blending basing with the others in the ancient chants. No one suspected the turmoil brewing beneath her placid exterior. She knew the weight of her decision, the irrevocable step she was about to take, but the prospect of freedom, of a life lived on her own terms, outweighed the fear. After breakfast, the preparations for the market began in earnest. Marie volunteered to organize the baskets in the dispensary. "Sister Eleanor will be swamped today," she said, her voice even. "I will ensure everything is ready for transport." The abbess, Sister Hildegard, a woman of strict adherence to monastic rules, but often too trusting, nodded approvingly. "A blessing, Sister Marie," she said. "Your diligence is exemplary." Marie moved about the dispensary, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She filled several smaller baskets with fragrant lavender and rosemary, placing them near the door for immediate collection. Then she retrieved the large chamomile basket from its alcove. She knew the usual procedure. 2 sisters would carry it out, or Brother Felix, a strong but slow-witted lay brother, would load it onto a handcart. She needed to be certain she was the only one overseeing its departure. As the first few market-bound sisters began to leave, Sister Eleanor called out, "Sister Marie, are the chamomile baskets ready?" "The demand will be high today," Marie replied. "Yes, Sister Portress. Just finishing the final touches. I will bring them out myself." She watched as Sister Eleanor became engrossed in a discussion with a local merchant about the price of eggs. Her back turned to the dispensary entrance. This was her chance. Marie slipped into the alcove, hoisted the large, empty chamomile basket, and with surprising agility for her small frame, lowered herself inside. She curled into a tight ball, pulling the heavy lid down over her head. The linen cloths muffled the sound, and the small air holes allowed just enough breath. The interior was dark, cramped, and smelled faintly of dried herbs and dust. She could feel the rough wicker pressing against her sides, but she pushed through the discomfort. A moment later, she heard the heavy thud of footsteps. Brother Felix, the lay brother, entered the dispensary. "Sister Marie, are the chamomile baskets ready?" he called out, his voice booming. Marie held her breath, willing him not to look too closely, not to notice the subtle shift in the basket's weight or position. She had calculated her actions precisely. She had left a smaller, obviously full basket of chamomile sitting just outside the alcove, intended as a decoy. Brother Felix, ever methodical, grunted as he lifted the decoy basket and carried it out. Marie heard him speaking to Sister Eleanor. "1 basket of chamomile, Sister Portress. Sister Marie said she was bringing the other." Sister Eleanor, still distracted, simply waved him on. "Very well, Brother Felix. Thank you. Hurry now. The market awaits." Marie heard the heavy door of the dispensary swing shut. She was still inside the building, but she was now effectively a parcel awaiting transport. She listened as Brother Felix returned. She felt the large basket shudder as he likely inspected it, perhaps giving it a slight nudge. Then, a sudden jolt. Brother Felix had lifted her. The world tilted. She was being carried suspended in darkness. The scent of dried chamomile was overpowering. She could hear Brother Felix's heavy breathing, the creak of the basket. She imagined him carrying her towards the main gate, her heart a frantic bird trapped in her chest. Every step was an agony of suspense. Would Sister Eleanor peer into the basket? Would a sudden jolt dislodge the lid? Would Brother Felix notice the unusually heavy weight for an empty basket? Convent's historical records, specifically an annotated inventory from the Feast of St. Nicholas in the early 13th century, curiously lists 1 large wicker basket, empty, dispatched to market, but also notes an unexplained shortage of chamomile for the week. The sounds around her intensified. She heard the rumble of cartwheels, the distant shouts of vendors, the babble of human voices. She knew she was nearing the main gate. She felt a brief pause in Brother Felix's gait, then heard Sister Eleanor's voice, closer now. "Ah, Brother Felix, the second chamomile basket. A good weight, it seems." Sister Marie was generous. Marie's muscles tensed. Was Sister Eleanor inspecting it? She felt a gentle jostle, as if the portress might have given the basket a tap. Then, A sudden, bright burst of light penetrated the wicker gaps. The lid was still securely on, but she could sense the open air, the vastness beyond the convent walls. The sounds of the market intensified a cacophony of life. She was outside. Brother Felix carried her for another minute or two, the sounds of the market growing louder. Then he set the basket down with a soft thump. Marie heard him greet someone, a voice she did not recognize. "Here is the chamomile for the stall," Brother Felix said. Then his footsteps retreated, presumably back towards the convent. She was now at the market stall amongst other goods. She waited, her body cramped, her muscles screaming for release. She could hear the chatter of customers, the clink of coins, the vibrant pulse of the outside world. She waited for what felt like an eternity, but was likely only 15 minutes. She knew the market stall would be busy and the sisters manning it would be focused on sales. Slowly, cautiously, she pushed up on the lid. It creaked faintly. She peered out. The stall was indeed bustling. Sister Brigid and Sister Ursula were engrossed in a transaction with the baker, their backs partially turned. With an agonizingly slow movement, Marie lifted the lid just enough to slip out. She was still bent double. Her habit rumbled, but she was free. She emerged from the basket, feigning a sudden need to stretch and gather some lost herbs. No one seemed to notice her unusual emergence. She quickly blended into the throng of people, her monastic habit, her only distinctive feature. She reached into the basket, retrieving her small pouch of coins and her change of clothes. She clutched them tightly, then began to walk, slowly at first, then with increasing speed, away from the convent stall, away from the market, away from the life she had just escaped. The bustling market absorbed her, a single nun dissolving into the joyous chaos of the feast of St. Nicholas, a memory the convent would never speak of, an absence marked only by a curious notation in an old inventory. Number 5. The disguise of a pilgrim and the treacherous road from the Convent of Our Lady of Sorrows. Convent of Our Lady of Sorrows, situated on a pilgrimage route high in the Pyrenees, was known for its stark beauty and its hospitality to weary travelers. Sister Eleanor, a woman in her late 20s, tall and sturdy with an unusually deep voice for a woman, had been placed there by her family to avoid an undesirable marriage alliance. Eleanor had always chafed at the strictures of monastic life, her spirit too free for the cloister's confines. She found solace not in prayer, but in listening to the tales of pilgrims who passed through their stories of distant lands and arduous journeys, fueling her own longing for freedom. Convent, being a hospice for pilgrims, had a more permeable boundary than most. While the cloistered area for the nuns was strictly guarded, the guest quarters and infirmary were accessible to outsiders. Pilgrims traveling in groups were a common sight, their varied attire and accents a constant reminder of the world beyond the convent's walls. Eleanor, assigned to infirmary duties due to her strength and calm demeanor, interacted with them regularly, attending to their ailments and listening to their travel narratives. Her plan was bold and simple: to disguise herself as a male pilgrim and walk out through the front gate, blending in with the departing group. The challenges were numerous. She needed suitable attire, a convincing disguise, and a group of pilgrims who would not scrutinize her too closely. She also needed a time when the gate would be open and the portress would be distracted. Over several months, Eleanor began her preparations. Pilgrims often left behind discarded items of clothing, particularly those that had become too worn or damaged on their long journeys. Eleanor, during her duties in the infirmary, began to quietly collect pieces of male attire: a worn tunic, a pair of rough wool breeches, a battered leather satchel, and most crucially, a wide-brimmed felt hat. She hid these items under loose floorboards in the infirmary storage room, beneath piles of old bandages and herbal poultices. The records of the infirmary, meticulously kept by the Abbess of Our Lady of Sorrows in a 14th-century ledger now held in the archives of the Bishopric of Tarbes, Note, an unusual depletion of clean linen for dressings, and several instances of missing pilgrims' belongings, attributing them to the carelessness of the infirmary staff. The most challenging aspect of her disguise was her appearance. Her hair, though short for a nun, was still too long for a male pilgrim. She would need to cut it even shorter, and her feminine features, though strong, would betray her. She needed something to obscure her face. The wide-brimmed hat would help casting shadows, but she also observed that many pilgrims had rough, unshaven faces, often dusty and weather-beaten. She began to experiment with dirt and ash to create a convincing beard-like shadow on her upper lip and chin, practicing in secret using a shard of polished metal as a mirror. She also worked on lowering her voice, practicing speaking in a gruffer, more guttural tone, mimicking the male pilgrims she had encountered. The opportunity arose with the arrival of a large group of German pilgrims heading south towards Santiago de Compostela. They were a boisterous, somewhat unobservant lot, more concerned with their journey and their spiritual quest than with the individual identities of those around them. They were due to depart at dawn just after the first bell for matins, a time when the convent was stirring but still largely quiet, and the gate would be opened for the morning's activity. On the night before their departure, Eleanor carefully shaved her head with a sharpened knife, cutting her hair as short as she dared. She then applied the mixture of ash and dirt to her face, grimacing at the coarse feel, but determined to make it convincing. She changed into the male clothing, feeling the unfamiliar scratch of the wool and leather against her skin. Tunic was a bit loose, the breeches tight, but they would suffice. She pulled the hat low over her brow, effectively shadowing her eyes. She filled the satchel with a small loaf of bread she had managed to hide from the kitchen, a water skin and a compass she had traded from a grateful pilgrim months prior. She also secreted away a small, crude map of the local roads. She waited in the infirmary storage room, listening to the monastic silence of the night. The first bell for matins rang, its mournful toll echoing through the stone corridors. She heard the soft sounds of sisters rising, the rustle of habits, the murmur of prayers. She waited until she heard the gate creak open, a sound that sent a surge of adrenaline through her veins. She slipped out of the storage room, her movements practiced and stealthy, and made her way towards the pilgrims' common room. The German pilgrims were gathering their voices, hushed but excited, their packs slung over their shoulders. Eleanor joined their ranks, melting into the shadows near the back of the group. She hunched her shoulders, trying to appear less tall, and kept her head down. As the group moved towards the main gate, Eleanor kept her eyes fixed on the ground, adopting the weary gait of a long-distance traveler. Portress Sister Gertrude, a severe woman with a sharp gaze, was already at her post, overseeing the departure. Sister Gertrude was known for her vigilance. This was the moment of truth. Eleanor heard Sister Gertrude's voice. "Godspeed, brothers and sisters. May your journey be blessed." Pilgrims responded with a chorus of "Amen" and "Gracias." Eleanor kept her voice silent, merely nodding her head in unison with the others. She felt Sister Gertrude's eyes sweep over the group, lingering for a moment on each face. Eleanor felt a cold sweat trickle down her spine. She kept her breath even, her posture that of a tired man. She passed directly in front of Sister Gertrude. For a heart-stopping moment, Eleanor thought Sister Gertrude's gaze sharpened as if she sensed something amiss. Then, a loud sneeze from one of the other pilgrims, and Sister Gertrude's attention flickered away as she offered a blessing to the sniffling traveler. Eleanor walked on her steps, light despite the weight of her disguise, the clatter of her stolen rosary beads still hanging from her belt, a muffled rhythm against her thigh. She stepped out into the crisp morning air, the mountain road stretching before her. The world outside the convent walls was colder, harsher, but also infinitely more vast. The German pilgrims, eager to continue their journey, were already beginning to spread out along the dusty road. Eleanor, still keeping her head low, increased her pace, slowly separating herself from the group. She veered off onto a smaller track, one she knew from her observations from the infirmary window, a path that led away from the main pilgrimage route and deeper into the mountains. She walked for hours, her muscles aching, the rough fabric of the male clothing chafing her skin. The sun rose higher, casting long shadows across the rugged landscape. She drank from her water skin, ate her dry bread, and consulted the crude map. She was free. The Convent of Our Lady of Sorrows continued its daily rhythm, welcoming pilgrims, unaware that one of its own had become a pilgrim of a different kind, vanishing into the vast anonymity of the road. The detailed departure logs of the convent from that year, housed in the diocesan archives, contain no record of Sister Eleanor's official departure, only a cryptic notation about a sudden and unexplained absence from infirmary duties. Number 4. The cloister's secret passage and the night of the Great Fire at the Convent of Saint Elizabeth. Convent of Saint Elizabeth, located within the sprawling ancient city of Orleans, was a venerable institution. Its foundations laid in the 10th century. Stone walls were thick, its windows heavily barred, and its gates massive and iron-bound. Sister Beatrice, a woman of sharp intellect and boundless curiosity, found herself confined within these walls after her family, minor nobility, fell from favor during a political upheaval. Beatrice had spent years poring over dusty manuscripts in the convent scriptorium, her mind yearning for knowledge and a world beyond the confines of the cloister. She was particularly fascinated by the convent's history, devouring old chronicles and architectural plans. It was in these ancient texts that she discovered whispers of a secret passage, rumored to have been built centuries ago to allow the nuns a clandestine escape during times of siege or plague. Passage, according to the cryptic descriptions, led from the convent's oldest cloister beneath the chapter house and emerged somewhere outside the city walls. Most sisters regarded these tales as mere legend, but Beatrice, with her analytical mind, saw them as a puzzle to be solved. Her research consumed her for years. She cross-referenced old building plans with historical accounts of sieges. She measured distances, studied the subtle variations in the stone and mortar of the cloister walls, and tapped on seemingly solid surfaces, listening for hollow sounds. Her efforts were meticulous, painstaking, and often frustrating. She spent countless hours in the quiet solitude of the scriptorium, under the pretext of transcribing ancient texts, but her true focus was on unraveling the convent's hidden secrets. The convent's original architectural plans, long thought lost but rediscovered in the early 15th century, and now housed in the Orleans City Archives, contain obscure markings in the foundation layers that correspond to Beatrice's later discoveries. Her breakthrough came during a severe winter, when a section of the chapter house floor collapsed due to water damage. While assisting with the repairs, Beatrice noticed an unusual discoloration in the ancient stone beneath the floor and a slight draft. Further investigation, disguised as a search for ancient artifacts, led her to a cleverly concealed latch hidden beneath a loose flagstone that appeared identical to its neighbors. With immense difficulty, she managed to pry it open, revealing a dark, narrow opening leading downwards. The air that wafted out was musty and cold, confirming her suspicions. This was it, the secret passage. The passage was little more than a cramped tunnel, barely wide enough for a person to crawl through. It was filled with centuries of dust and debris, the air thick with the smell of damp earth. But Beatrice knew its potential. She spent weeks secretly clearing a path, removing loose stones and accumulated dirt, moving slowly, cautiously during the dead of night, often after Compline, when the convent was deepest in sleep. She used a small, blunt piece of metal, ostensibly for cleaning candles, to scrape away the grime. The danger of discovery was immense. A stray noise, a lamp beam catching her, a sister rising for a midnight prayer. Any of these could doom her. She worked in absolute darkness, relying on touch and memory, her hands constantly scraping against rough stone and damp earth. The external exit of the passage was, as the legends described, outside the city walls, amidst a tangle of ancient overgrown vines and a collapsed section of a forgotten aqueduct. It was perfectly concealed, almost invisible to the casual observer. The passage itself was long, extending for what felt like hundreds of feet, curving beneath the city's foundations. It was also incredibly narrow in places, threatening to trap her. The ideal moment for escape presented itself unexpectedly. A devastating fire broke out in the city. A baker's oven, left untended, ignited the dry timbers of his shop, and the flames quickly spread, driven by a strong autumn wind. The Convent of Saint Elizabeth, though situated within stone walls, was still vulnerable. The immediate concern was the possibility of embers carried over the walls, and the smoke, thick and acrid, permeated the entire city. The city records of Orleans from 1386 detail the Great Fire of St. Clement's Street, noting the extensive damage and the bravery of the cloistered sisters of St. Elizabeth who provided refuge and aid. The fire caused widespread panic and chaos. The convent gates, usually locked with heavy bolts, were opened to allow injured citizens to seek refuge in the infirmary and to allow secular authorities to assess the damage. Nuns were mobilized to fetch water, to tend to the wounded, and to offer prayers for the suffering city. The entire convent was in a state of high alert, its usual routines shattered. The portress, Sister Martha, normally vigilant, was distracted by the constant stream of injured people and the urgent requests for assistance. Beatrice chose the height of the chaos, just after midnight, when the fire was at its most intense, its orange glow painting the night sky, and the screams and shouts from the city were at their loudest. She had prepared a small bundle, a simple tunic, a coarse cloak, a small pouch of coins, and a flint and steel for making fire. She knew she could not leave in her habit. She carried them hidden under her scapular as she went about her duties, fetching water for the infirmary. She made her way to the old cloister, ensuring no one was observing her. The cloister, usually a place of quiet contemplation, was now eerily deserted, the sisters busy elsewhere. The smoke, though still outside, was starting to drift in, filling the air with a choking haze. Under the pretense of retrieving more bandages from the storage room, Beatrice slipped into the chapter house. With practiced ease, she located the loose flagstone, lifted it, and revealed the dark maw of the passage. She took a deep breath, the acrid smoke already irritating her lungs, and plunged into the darkness, pulling the flagstone back into place after her. The passage was stifling, the air stale and heavy. She crawled, pushing her small bundle before her, her hands and knees scraping against the rough earth and jagged stones. The sounds of the fire above, the distant shouts, the roar of the flames, were muffled but still terrifyingly present. She could feel the vibrations of the city above her, the very ground shaking with the intensity of the inferno. She crawled for what felt like an eternity, the darkness absolute, the air growing thinner. Her claustrophobia threatened to overwhelm her. She pushed through her mind, fixed on the open sky, on the freedom that lay beyond. She reached a particularly narrow section where the tunnel seemed to constrict, pressing in on her from all sides. For a moment, she thought she was stuck, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm. But with a desperate push, she forced herself through, emerging into a slightly wider section. Finally, after what seemed like an age, she saw a faint glimmer of light ahead, a distant crack in the darkness. It was the exit. She crawled faster, her body aching, her muscles screaming with exertion. The air grew fresher, though still tainted with the scent of smoke. She pushed through the tangle of vines and undergrowth that concealed the opening, emerging into the cool night air outside the city walls. The sight that greeted her was apocalyptic. The city of Orleans glowed with a terrifying orange light smoke billowing into the sky, sparks showering down like malevolent rain. The sound of the fire was a roar, a living beast devouring everything in its path. She was free, but she was in the midst of a disaster. She quickly donned her secular clothes, discarding her habit in the tangled undergrowth, a symbol of the life she had abandoned. She moved away from the city walls, her gaze fixed on the open countryside, the path less traveled. She did not look back at the burning city, nor at the convent she had just escaped. She was a refugee, both from the flames and from her past. Chroniclers of Orleans City, in their accounts of the Great Fire, note the miraculous survival of the Convent of Saint Elizabeth, spared by a shift in wind. But there is no mention of the nun who vanished into the smoke-filled night through a passage known only in legend. Number 3. The Stolen Key and the River's Embrace, from the Convent of Saint Clare. The Convent of Saint Clare, a Poor Clare monastery in northern France, was renowned for its strict enclosure. Its walls were high, its windows few and heavily gridded, and its main gate, a massive oak affair, was secured by no fewer than 3 heavy locks, the keys to which were held by the abbess, the portress, and the matron of the convent. Sister Isabel, a young woman of noble birth, had been sent to the convent after her family's political leanings put them at odds with the ruling monarch. She was vivacious and intelligent, a keen observer of human nature, and deeply resentful of her enforced piety. Convent was built on the banks of a slow-moving river, the River Lys, which provided water for the convent's mill and laundry. A small, often locked postern gate led directly to a narrow, slippery path down to the riverbank. This gate was rarely used, typically only for collecting water. For the laundry or for disposing of certain wastes, it was secured by a single, heavy iron lock. Key to this gate, known as the River Key, was held by the matron of the convent, Sister Beatrice, a formidable woman with a stern demeanor and an unyielding commitment to the convent's rules. Isabel's plan was audacious: to steal the River Key, unlock the postern gate, and escape by river. The challenge was multifaceted: obtaining the key, navigating the dark river, and avoiding detection during the escape itself. She knew Sister Beatrice was meticulously organized, keeping the River Key on a heavy chain secured to her belt during the day and under her pillow at night. Isabel began her preparations by observing Sister Beatrice's habits with the precision of a hunter. She noted the matron's routine, her daily nap in her cell after sext, her habit of placing the key chain on a small table beside her bed, her slight deafness that made her less likely to hear soft movements. Isabel also started practicing her swimming skills during the nuns' weekly communal bath in the laundry house, feigning clumsiness and splashing about while secretly strengthening her strokes. Convent's internal ledger from the mid-14th century, found in the Benedictine archives of Ghent, contains a peculiar entry from Sister Beatrice. Item: Sister Isabel, a persistent splash in the bath must be corrected. Her opportunity to steal the key arose during a particularly busy day in the laundry house. Convent was preparing for a large shipment of cleaned linens to a neighboring diocese, and all available hands were called to help. Sister Beatrice, overseeing the operation, was uncharacteristically distracted, her focus entirely on the quality of the scrubbing and rinsing. Isabel feigned a sudden dizzy spell, collapsing dramatically near the matron's cell. Sister Beatrice, ever practical, though outwardly gruff, immediately came to her aid, loosening Isabel's habit and calling for assistance. In the brief moment of distraction, as Sister Beatrice knelt beside her, Isabel's nimble fingers, quick as a serpent, deftly unclipped the River Key from Sister Beatrice's belt. She palmed it, the cold iron a burning sensation in her hand, and tucked it deep into the folds of her habit. The matron, too, focused on Isabel's feigned faint, noticed nothing. "You must rest, Sister Isabel," Sister Beatrice commanded. "This work is too much for you." Isabel, still feigning weakness, was led back to her cell, the precious key now concealed beneath her mattress. The convent chronicle from the time in its account of the great linen preparations oddly mentions Sister Beatrice's unusual agitation over a missing key for a brief period later that day. Attributing it to the stress of the work, the theft of the key was only the first step. The escape itself would need to happen at night, under the cover of darkness. The ideal time was just after Compline, when the convent settled into its nightly silence, and before matins, when the first stirrings of the new day began. The moonless night was crucial for concealment. She would also need a small, sturdy container to carry her few possessions. She found an old, watertight wooden box, discarded from the kitchen, which she carefully cleaned and lined. Inside, she placed a warm woolen cloak, a small amount of dried bread, and the pouch of coins she had accumulated over the years. The chosen night was dark and still, a thin mist rising from the river. Isabel waited in her cell until the last sounds of sisterly footsteps faded, and the heavy snore of Sister Agnes in the adjacent cell confirmed the convent was asleep. She rose, silently retrieving the key and her small box. Her heart pounded, but her movements were controlled and deliberate. She slipped out of her cell, moving like a shadow through the hushed corridors, past the sleeping nuns, past the watchful eyes of the saints in their niches. She reached the laundry house, her destination. The air was damp and cool, smelling of soap and wet linen. She found the postern gate, its heavy iron lock gleaming faintly in the moonlight. With trembling hands, she inserted the key, turned with a groan and a click, a sound that seemed deafening in the silence of the night. She opened the gate just enough to slip through, then carefully relocked it from the outside, dropping the key into the river below. The splash was tiny, barely audible, but it was a final, irreversible act. Path down to the river was steep and slippery, covered in moss. She slid more than once, her hands scraping against the rough stones. Finally, she reached the water's edge. The river was dark, its surface reflecting the inky sky. The current, though slow, was still powerful. She shed her heavy habit, leaving it on the bank, a symbol of her discarded life. Dressed in her simple linen undergarments, she secured the small wooden box to her back with a length of braided linen, ensuring it was watertight. She waded into the cold water, the chill seeping into her bones. The river embraced her, its current pulling at her. She pushed off the bank, swimming strongly, directing herself downstream. Convent walls, towering above her, began to recede into the darkness, their grim outlines slowly dissolving into the mist. She could still hear the faint hoot of an owl from the convent's ancient oaks, a sound that usually marked the deep quiet of monastic sleep. She swam for what felt like hours, the current aiding her, the rhythmic pull of her arms and legs her only focus. Cold was intense, but the exhilaration of her freedom propelled her forward. She passed under the dark arches of an old stone bridge, its silhouette looming overhead. She knew from her observations that this bridge marked the boundary of the convent's immediate lands. Beyond it lay the open countryside, and eventually the secular world. Finally, her muscles aching, her body shivering uncontrollably, she spotted a cluster of willow trees on the bank, their branches drooping into the water. This was her planned landing spot. She struggled towards them, pulling herself onto the muddy bank, gasping for breath. She lay there for a moment, shivering, soaked, but gloriously free. She rose, unwrapped her woolen cloak from the box, and huddled into its warmth. She looked back, but the convent was no longer visible, swallowed by the darkness and the river mist. The bells of St. Clair would soon ring for matins, marking the start of another day of monastic routine. But for Isabel, that life was now a distant echo, a memory fading into the cold embrace of the river. Convent's records from the following morning would simply note the inexplicable disappearance of Sister Isabel and the loss of the River Key, an enigma that would puzzle the matron for years. Number 2. The Harvest Cart and the Long Road to Freedom, from the Convent of the Holy Sepulchre. Convent of the Holy Sepulchre, a Cistercian monastery in rural England, was known for its vast agricultural lands and its self-sufficiency. Situated far from any major town, it was a world unto itself. Its sisters devoted to manual labor, prayer, and austere living. Sister Catherine, a woman of strong build and practical mind, had been a lay sister for 15 years, tasked primarily with agricultural duties, including the tending of sheep and the cultivation of grain. Her family, impoverished tenants of a local lord, had sent her to the convent, seeking the stability of a life of labor and spiritual devotion. Yet Catherine harbored a quiet yearning for a family of her own, a life rooted in the soil but on her own terms, free from the rigid schedule and enforced celibacy of the cloister. Convent's primary interaction with the outside world came during harvest season, when immense quantities of grain, wool, and other produce were transported to market towns or to other monastic houses. Large carts pulled by oxen or horses regularly passed through the main gate, laden with goods. These carts were typically driven by male farmhands or lay brothers who, though under the convent's employ, were not cloistered. Catherine had observed these departures for years, noting the loading process, the routes taken, and the relatively lax inspection of outgoing goods. Once the gatekeeper was satisfied with the manifest, her plan was to hide herself within a cartload of grain during the peak of the harvest season, when the sheer volume of produce would make a thorough inspection impractical. The challenge was finding a cart that was not too heavily packed, avoiding discovery during loading, and enduring the journey in a confined, uncomfortable space. She also needed to ensure her absence from the convent would not be immediately noticed. Catherine began her preparations months before the harvest. During her daily duties in the fields, she started collecting loose grain, chaff, and straw, storing it in a secluded section of the granary, ostensibly for patching leaky roofs or for new bedding for the animals. Her true intention was to create a comfortable, breathable hiding place within a grain cart. She also started wearing an extra layer of rough, loose-fitting undergarments beneath her habit, a form of padding, and a thick woolen scarf she had secretly woven from discarded wool. Convent's grain inventory records, meticulously kept by the cellaress, Sister Agnes, and now held in the archives of the Diocese of Winchester from the late 12th century, show a puzzling slight discrepancy in the granary's straw and chaff stores during that period. The harvest season arrived, a whirlwind of ceaseless labor from dawn until dusk. The fields buzzed with activity, the air thick with dust, and the smell of ripe grain. Carts rumbled in and out of the granary, being loaded with prodigious amounts of wheat. Catherine, known for her tireless work ethic, volunteered for every shift, ensuring she was present during the loading of the market-bound carts. The day of her escape arrived, a sweltering late August afternoon. Convent was a hive of activity. Most sisters and lay brothers focused on the urgent task of bringing in the last of the wheat before an approaching storm. Catherine, covered in sweat and dust, had spent the morning working in the fields. She knew the particular cart she would use, one often designated for the farthest market town, ensuring a longer journey and more time before her absence might be noted. The cart was being loaded with the last of the day's grain. As the cart was nearly full, and the farmhands paused for a quick drink of water, Catherine saw her opportunity. She positioned herself at the back of the cart, ostensibly to secure a loose bundle of straw. With a practiced movement, she quickly burrowed into the loose grain, pulling handfuls of wheat and chaff over her head, creating a shallow cavity for herself. The thickness of the grain provided excellent concealment. The straw and chaff she had secretly gathered previously ensured she had a small, breathable pocket of air. The dust was overwhelming, and she fought the urge to cough. burying her face into the scratchy wool of her scarf. Moments later, she felt the cart shift as more grain was shoveled on top of her. The weight was considerable, pressing down on her, making it difficult to breathe, but she endured, her body curled into a fetal position, her heart thumping like a drum. She heard the farmhands talking, their voices muffled by the grain. "That's it, lads, full to the brim, ready for market." Then the jolting started. The heavy cart began to move, slowly at first, then picking up speed as it left the granary and rumbled towards the main gate. Catherine felt every bump, every rut in the dirt road. The dust was suffocating, and the smell of the grain, though familiar, now felt oppressive. She could hear the creak of the cart wheels, the distant shouts of the driver, and the rhythmic plod of the oxen. She felt a brief pause. They were at the main gate. She heard the gatekeeper, Brother Martin, exchanging pleasantries with the driver, discussing the weather and the day's yield. "Full cart, Brother Thomas?" Brother Martin asked. "Aye, Brother Martin, full to bursting, the Lord provides," the driver replied. Catherine held her breath, willing the gatekeeper not to look too closely, not to probe the depths of the grain. The gate creaked open and the cart jolted forward again. She was out. The sounds changed, becoming less defined, more open. The ruts in the road were deeper, the jolting more pronounced. She knew they were on the long, dusty road leading to the market town. She lay in the darkness, enduring the discomfort. Her mind focused on the journey. Hours passed. The sun rose higher, and the grain grew hot, the heat radiating through her clothes. She felt a burning thirst. The cart eventually stopped. She heard voices, more varied now, the sounds of a busy town. She waited. She knew the cart would be unloaded at the market square. She had to escape before the grain was emptied. She felt the cart being moved again, slowly, then set down with a final thud. She heard the driver calling out, "Grain for sale, fresh from the Holy Sepulchre." She waited for the precise moment. She felt the weight on top of her shift, as if a large shovel was scooping away the grain. This was her chance. As a significant amount of grain was removed, creating a slightly larger space above her, she quickly but carefully pushed herself up. Emerging from the golden mound of wheat, she was covered in dust, her habit rumpled, but she was out. The market square was a riot of color and noise. No one seemed to notice the dusty nun emerging from a grain cart. She quickly brushed herself off, her eyes scanning for a path to escape. She saw a narrow alleyway between two stalls leading away from the main square. Without a moment's hesitation, she ducked into it, moving swiftly, her strong legs carrying her away from the market. She blended into the crowd, a single anonymous figure disappearing into the bustling streets of the town. She found a quiet corner behind a tannery, shed her habit, leaving it in a refuse pile, and dressed in the simple secular clothes she had secretly worn underneath. The Convent of the Holy Sepulchre, in its chronicled daily reports from that harvest, recorded the unexplained failure of Sister Catherine to report for evening prayers, a mystery that was never resolved. Number 1. The feast day distraction and the night of the broken walls of the Convent of Saint Ursula. The Convent of Saint Ursula, a Franciscan monastery on a remote island off the coast of Brittany, was famed for its spiritual solitude and its impenetrable defenses. Built upon ancient cliffs, its only access was a narrow, treacherous causeway, exposed only at low tide or by boat to a small guarded harbor. Sister Hilera, a woman of deep sorrow and quiet determination, had been widowed young and sent to the convent by her family, who feared for her safety in a volatile political landscape. Hilera mourned her lost husband and children, and her heart yearned for the world and the family she had been forced to leave behind. The island convent, due to its isolation, was self-sufficient but also entirely cut off during high tide. The walls were massive, carved from the very rock of the island, and the only vulnerable point was the causeway itself, which was guarded by a fortified gatehouse. Escape from the island was considered impossible. Alara, however, possessed a detailed knowledge of the island's natural features. Having spent hours in quiet contemplation by the sea, observing the tides, the rock formations, and the movements of the local fishing boats, her plan was incredibly risky: to escape the convent during a major feast day when the sisters would be distracted, by scaling a section of the cliff face near the convent walls, then descending to the causeway during the precise window of low tide and signaling a passing fishing boat. Greatest challenge was finding a weakness in the impenetrable cliff wall. Ilara's preparations spanned a full year. She had noticed, during her walks along the coastal path, a series of ancient, natural fissures in the rock, almost like crude steps, leading up a section of the cliff face just beyond the convent's main walls. These fissures were mostly obscured by thick moss and thorny bushes. She also observed a particular section of the convent wall near the old burial grounds that appeared to be built directly onto a natural rock outcrop, rather than deep foundations, making it potentially weaker. She also noticed that the stones in this section were older, more worn, and occasionally had small gaps. Under the guise of collecting rare medicinal herbs that grew on the cliffs, Alara began to meticulously map out a climbing route, memorizing every handhold and foothold. She also started to discreetly test the stones in the specific section of the wall she had identified, slowly and carefully wiggling them, testing their stability. She found that a few of the stones, particularly near the top, were surprisingly loose. She also began to acquire a length of strong, thin rope, ostensibly for securing bundles of herbs, but secretly for her escape. She kept it hidden under a loose stone in the convent's herb drying shed. The convent's herbalist's journal, from the early 13th century, preserved in the archives of the Diocese of Quimper, contains Alara's meticulous, almost obsessive entries about the unusual geological formations of the western cliffs and the surprising instability of certain cliffside vegetation. Perfect opportunity arrived with the feast of Saint Ursula herself, the convent's patron saint. It was a day of immense celebration, drawing visiting clergy and rarely noble benefactors who braved the causeway to join the festivities. The entire convent would be focused on religious services, communal feasting, and welcoming guests. The usual strict routines would be relaxed, and the attention of the gatekeepers and watch sisters would be diverted. Crucially, the evening tide on this particular feast day would be unusually low, creating a wider, more accessible causeway. On the evening of the feast day, as the Vespers bells tolled and the main hall hummed with celebration, Alara feigned a sudden headache and retired to her cell, claiming she needed rest. Her cell, fortunately, was located in a quieter wing of the convent, close to the old burial grounds and the section of wall she had targeted. She dressed in a simple dark tunic and leggings she had sewn from scraps of old habit cloth, and secreted the rope and a small sharp stone tool into her pockets. She also carried a small, water-resistant pouch containing a few coins and a piece of dried fish. She waited until the sounds of merriment from the feast hall began to fade and the convent lights dimmed as the sisters retired for the night. The island was plunged into a deep, starless night. The only sounds the relentless roar of the waves and the mournful cries of gulls. She slipped out of her cell, moving like a ghost through the silent corridors towards the old burial grounds. The air was cold and damp, carrying the scent of salt and ancient earth. She reached the targeted section of the wall. Using the sharp stone tool, she began to meticulously pry loose the stones she had identified as weak. It was slow, laborious work, requiring immense precision to avoid making too much noise. Each stone she dislodged was carefully placed on the ground so it would not clatter. She felt the cold sweat on her brow, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm. She focused on the task, blocking out everything else. Finally, After what felt like an eternity, she managed to create a small opening, just large enough for her to squeeze through. She slipped through the gap, pulling her body through the rough stone, scraping her skin. She was now on the outside of the wall, on a narrow ledge, overlooking the sheer drop to the sea. The wind whipped at her, threatening to pull her off balance. She could see the dark expanse of the ocean below, the white foam of crashing waves. This was the most dangerous part. She secured one end of her rope to a protruding, sturdy stone in the cliff face, testing its strength. Then, with a deep breath, she began her descent down the treacherous cliff, using the natural fissures and the rope for support. Her hands, raw and bleeding, found purchase on the rough rock. The salt spray lashed at her face, and the wind howled around her, making it difficult to maintain her grip. She moved slowly, carefully, her muscles screaming with exertion, her mind focused on each handhold, each step. Below her, the causeway was now fully exposed. A thin, dark ribbon stretching towards the distant mainland. The tide was at its lowest. She reached the bottom of the cliff, collapsing onto the damp sand. Exhausted, but filled with a surge of adrenaline, she quickly scrambled towards the causeway, her legs aching, her feet numb with cold. As she reached the causeway, she heard the distant sounds of a boat-engine fishermen returning late from their nightly catch. This was her final opportunity. She had learned from her observations that these local fishermen sometimes picked up passengers in distress for a small fee. She took out the piece of dried fish from her pouch and held it high. Then the small pouch of coins, waving it frantically in the direction of the distant lights. The boat was still far away, a tiny speck on the vast, dark ocean. She waited, her heart in her throat, watching the boat's approach. It came closer, its engine growing louder. She continued to wave, desperate to be seen. The boat finally drew alongside the causeway, its lights illuminating her solitary figure. A gruff voice called out, "What troubles you, lass?" Alara, her voice hoarse from exhaustion and the salt wind, simply said, "Passage, if you please, any port." The fisherman, a burly man with a weathered face, stared at her for a moment, then shrugged. He helped her climb aboard, pulling her from the cold embrace of the causeway. The boat turned, heading away from the island towards the mainland. Ilara sat huddled in the stern, shivering but looking back at the dark silhouette of the Convent of Saint Ursula, slowly disappearing into the mist and the dawn. She was free. The convent's chronicle of the feast of Saint Ursula the following morning, while celebrating the miraculous spiritual presence of the Blessed Mother, also notes a curious dislodgement of stones in the western wall near the sacred burial ground, a mystery never fully explained.